Tonight, we're looking into the weirdest status symbol humanity ever cooked up. The color of your own skin. It's wild to think about. But for the vast majority of history, the exact same healthy tan that people pay $40 for at a salon today would have branded you a total outcast. Someone sitting firmly at the bottom of the social ladder, somewhere between the farm animals and the dirt. We're talking about the tanning phenomenon, a massive, centuries-long obsession where the elite treated the sun like a dangerous enemy, then eventually started chasing it like it was prime real estate, only to sprint away from it again the second a doctor mentioned melanoma. Let's hit the brakes for a second. Have you ever wondered why your ancestors would have been horrified by the idea of a beach vacation? Or why women once willingly applied actual poison just to look like a statue? Why a tan could mark you as the lowliest worker or the most elite person in the room, depending entirely on which century you were born in? You have to wonder who decided that pale was the gold standard, only to flip the script and then flip it back, all while selling you products at every single turn. Now, imagine waking up in a world where the sun is a mortal enemy. Your skin has to be covered, shielded, and gloved at all times because in this society, a single freckle could destroy your reputation. Welcome to the long, ridiculous war between human beings and a giant ball of light. Let's break it down. Here is the simplest truth that explains everything. For almost all of human history, a tan was a disaster. It wasn't athletic or glowing. It was bad news. If your skin was browned or weathered, it signaled one thing to everyone. You worked outside in the dirt like a beast of burden. Pale skin, on the other hand, whispered the most powerful message possible without saying a word. I don't labor. Someone else does that for me. For thousands of years, across completely different cultures, the message was remarkably consistent. The lighter your skin, the further you were from the sweat and toil of the field, and the closer you were to power and luxury. Think about how strange that is. We like to tell ourselves that beauty standards are about beauty, about what's naturally pleasing to the eye. But this was never about looks. It was a status report written directly onto your body. It was updated daily, and it was impossible to hide. A merchant could lie about his bank account, and a commoner could borrow a nice coat, but they couldn't fake a complexion that had lived its whole life in the shade. The sun was a brutal, honest accountant, and it kept everyone's books in public view. It's actually hilarious when you zoom out. We imagine our ancestors as hyper-practical, just trying to survive plagues and bad harvests. Yet, the moment they had a little extra money, they immediately started judging each other by skin tone in the most arbitrary way possible. It's like a group of people surviving a shipwreck and immediately starting a debate about whose driftwood furniture is tackier. The human urge to sort ourselves into better than you and worse than you is older and tougher than almost anything else we do. You can see it perfectly. The Lord rides by on his horse, pale as a candle, hands soft and untouched by the elements. Everyone knows instantly he's important. Behind him walk the field workers, skin browned like saddle leather, lined and squinting. Everyone knows their place immediately. Nobody had to write it down. It was just absorbed generation after generation until Pale and Highborn felt as naturally connected as thunder and rain. So, that is our starting line. Pale was power, brown was burden, and the gap between them was measured in sun exposure. Let's travel back to the banks of the Nile, where the sun wasn't just a warm companion. It was a daily interrogation lamp. Look at the painted walls of ancient Egyptian tombs, and you'll notice something strange. The men are usually depicted in a deep reddish brown, while the women are painted in soft, pale yellows and creams. Some of this was artistic shorthand, a code for social standing. Men were shown as outdoor beings, baked by the world, while elite women were shown as indoor creatures, shielded and shaded. Either way, the pattern was set thousands of years ago. The sun touches the laborer, but the lady stays in the shade. Now, to be fair, ancient Egypt was obsessed with grooming, and that obsession crossed all classes. People used oils to protect their skin against the brutal, dry heat, and they wore heavy kohl eyeliner. They treated personal care as a sacred duty. But underneath that practical care, there was that quiet social signal. The convention of painting noble women as pale wasn't random. It reinforced the idea that a woman of status didn't spend her days roasting in a field. It's a great contradiction. They worshipped the sun as a god, yet the elite preferred their women to look as if that god had never once touched their skin. It's like deeply admiring a celebrity while making sure you're never seen standing next to them. Now, drift across the Mediterranean to ancient Greece, where the expectations for respectable women became even more rigid. Women were expected to spend their lives tucked away inside the home. The result, conveniently, was skin that stayed pale, smooth, and untouched by the sun. Pale skin became the gold standard. The problem, of course, was that not every woman was naturally moonbeam colored. And so, the cosmetics industry of the ancient world went to work. The go-to solution was a white powder made from lead. It was applied to the face to fake that luminous, never-seen-the-daylight glow. It worked perfectly, right up until you remember that it was literally lead, slowly poisoning the very women trying to look their best. It's like inventing a face cream out of something you'd find behind a hazardous materials sign today. The indoor life of a Greek woman wasn't just a preference, it was a social contract. The public square belonged to the men. The further a woman's world stayed from the sunlit outdoors, the more honorable her family appeared. Her complexion was, effectively, a financial statement she wore on her face. When nature didn't provide that pallor, the lead powder, called psimithion, stepped in. It was prized because it was so opaque and smooth. Imagine sitting at a small bronze mirror, dabbing this white powder onto your cheeks, feeling great about how fashionable you look, with no idea you're introducing a heavy metal into your body. The cruelest part? Lead doesn't politely leave once it's done flattering you. Prolonged use damages the skin, which just encourages you to apply even more to cover the damage, in a cycle of self-destruction dressed up as beauty. The Greeks weren't foolish. They were just trapped within the limits of what they knew, chasing an ideal with the only tools available. Beauty had become a project, something you built with powder and protected with walls, rather than something you simply were. The sun remained the enemy, the indoors remained the fortress, and the price of admission to that ideal was measured in slow, invisible harm. Keep that in mind, because just across the sea, the Romans were taking notes, ready to do what they always did with a good idea. The Romans, never a group to let a good idea go to waste, took the Greek obsession with pallor and sprinted straight off a cliff with it. They didn't just want to be pale. They wanted to be statue perfect, and they were willing to turn their bodies into chemistry experiments to achieve it. Wealthy Roman women coated their faces in white lead, the same toxic sludge the Greeks favored, but they didn't stop there. Archaeological records and historical texts reveal a truly deranged parade of substances slathered onto skin in the name of vanity. We're talking about concoctions that sound less like beauty regimens and more like something you'd find in a medieval torture chamber. At the top of the "how is this real" list, crocodile dung. Yes, they believed smearing reptile excrement across their cheeks would leave them glowing. It's hard to imagine the desperation required to apply literal waste to your face, but that's the reality of the Roman beauty cult. The goal was always the same: lighten, brighten, and at all costs, look nothing like the sun-scorched farmhands sweating in the fields beyond the city walls. To be pale in Rome was to announce without saying a word that your hardest daily chore was deciding which couch to recline on for dinner. Roman beauty was a highly calculated enterprise. The poet Ovid even acted as a self-appointed beauty consultant, documenting pastes made from ground beans, crushed petals, honey, and terrifyingly, various toxic mineral additives meant to bleach the skin. Imagine a Roman noblewoman's morning. She's surrounded by enslaved women whose sole purpose is to paint her face. They'd layer on the lead, redden the lips with dangerous mercuric sulfide, and transform a human face into a mask of death-like perfection. It was a daily ritual of grueling effort, all to prove one thing: that this woman was so wealthy, so removed from the indignity of work, that the sun hadn't been allowed to touch her in years. When you look closely, it's honestly disturbing how much this resembles our modern world. Strip away the togas and you see the exact same machine. A thriving beauty economy, experts pushing products, social pressure demanding compliance, and a steady undercurrent of lethal risk that everyone just collectively decided to ignore. The technology has evolved, but the underlying rot, the willingness to sacrifice health for the approval of others, hasn't changed a bit. The lead kept poisoning, the bizarre pastes kept selling, and the sun remained the ultimate villain in the eyes of the elite. When Rome eventually collapsed and Europe slid into the Middle Ages, you might have expected this toxic, high-maintenance vanity to vanish alongside the aqueducts and the baths. It didn't. The obsession with pale skin survived the fall of empires, settled into the brutal feudal landscape, and there it turned sharper, harsher, and far more rigid. In medieval Europe, the rules hardened into something resembling a death sentence for your social standing. In a world of lords and serfs, your skin was your uniform. Peasants worked the land from sunrise until they physically collapsed, and the sun repaid them with leathery, weather-beaten skin that shouted their poverty to anyone within a mile. Nobles, meanwhile, made it their full-time job to look as though they were creatures of the dark. To a medieval mind, a tan wasn't a healthy glow. It was a badge of shame. It was proof that you were bent double, pulling turnips for a master who owned your life. This is where the alarm bells really start ringing. Fair skin became twisted into a proxy for virtue. The idealized noble lady in poetry wasn't just pale. She was luminously fair, as though her lack of melanin was proof of a wholly unblemished soul. A sun-darkened laborer, by contrast, was viewed as earthy and a common coded way of saying they were spiritually and physically inferior. That is an astronomical amount of baggage to attach to a bit of sunshine. The reality was a special kind of cruelty. The peasants were judged by the very sun that their survival depended on. They were mocked for the marks of their labor, while the nobles lived in a state of constant, suffocating enclosure. To be a high-born woman in this era was to be a prisoner of your own status. Protecting your precious pale skin became a campaign waged with the intensity of a military siege. Imagine it. The moment you stepped outside, you were essentially armoring up. You draped yourself in heavy veils, suffocated your hands in gloves, and pulled hoods low over your face. A parasol wasn't a fashion accessory, it was a tactical shield. The clothing was the most alarming part. You wore long sleeves, high necklines, and layers of thick fabric that covered every square inch of skin, topped with veils and hats. In the summer heat, this wasn't an outfit. It was a personal greenhouse, as you were effectively cooking yourself alive in your own clothes to avoid the sin of a tan. You didn't walk, you navigated. You planned your routes through the shade, like a soldier crossing a battlefield under sniper fire. If you had to travel, you moved in curtain litters, terrified that a single stray beam of light might touch your cheek and ruin your reputation. The irony is as sharp as a blade. All this exhausting, sweat-drenched labor, the daily regimen of discipline, the suffocating layers, the constant fear, was performed to look effortless. The noble woman worked harder than the peasant to appear as though she had never lifted a finger. But even the most obsessive avoidance wasn't enough. When prevention failed, when a freckle appeared or the skin became sallow, women turned to the apothecaries. And this is where the story turns truly dangerous. Generations of women relied on homemade concoctions to bleach their skin. While some recipes were simple, crushed flowers or egg whites, many were absolute nightmares. They used mercury to strip the skin, lead to whiten it, and harsh lies that caused chemical burns. The kitchen table optimism here is haunting. These women would spend hours grinding almonds, mixing honey or soaking bread in vinegar, hoping it would make them beautiful, all while unknowingly applying ingredients that would slowly destroy their organs. They were paying the ultimate price, their health, their fertility, and eventually their lives, all to hide from the sun. The tragedy is that the harder they worked to appear pure and noble, the more they were physically poisoning themselves. It was a slow, invisible suicide, practiced by thousands, all in the service of a beauty standard that didn't just demand your attention, it demanded your life. The most effective whiteners, those that delivered that dramatic, opaque, ghostly pallor, were almost always rooted in heavy metals. Lead and mercury were the gold standard. They didn't just tint the skin, they smoothed it and bleached it with a finality that no simple almond paste could ever replicate. Mercury-based formulas were particularly brutal. They essentially acted as a chemical peel, stripping away the top layers of your epidermis to reveal a fresh, miracle surface beneath. It felt like a triumph, right up until the moment you realized that your face was actually disintegrating. These weren't niche products used by the reckless. They were the mainstream foundation of the beauty industry. They were recommended by doctors, trusted by royalty, and passed down through generations. There were no warning labels, no regulatory agencies, and no scientists to pull you aside and whisper that your favorite face cream was quietly dismantling your nervous system. A woman could use these preparations for decades, watching her health fail, hair falling out, teeth loosening, complexion turning gray, without ever once suspecting the pot on her dressing table. Ignorance wasn't a choice, it was the baseline of the era. You used what was available and you trusted what the elite trusted. This is the recurring tragedy of the pale ideal. The pursuit of beauty was, by design, the pursuit of your own destruction. The victims weren't vain or foolish. They were ordinary people responding to a rigid social code, paying the ultimate price in a world that viewed their sacrifice as perfectly normal. Nowhere did this dark bargain play out more famously than on the face of Queen Elizabeth I. She didn't just follow the trend. She became the living embodiment of it. After smallpox left her skin scarred, she leaned into a heavy paste of white lead and vinegar. It created an almost inhuman porcelain mask that radiated power, virtue, and untouchable royalty. The look was so effective that the entire royal court scrambled to replicate it, painting themselves into matching ghosts. But the lead, applied daily, ate away at the very skin it was meant to hide. The result? A cycle of ruin. The lead caused further scarring, which demanded even thicker layers of lead to cover the new damage. It was a beauty routine that destroyed the canvas and then sold you more paint to fix the mess. The substance was called Venetian ceruse, a name that sounds elegant until you realize it was essentially a lead-based suicide pact. For Elizabeth, this wasn't just fashion, it was statecraft. In an age where a queen's image was political capital, that white mask projected a near-divine aura. She wasn't just a ruler, she was a legend who seemed to float above the concerns of mortal flesh. But the legend was literally killing the woman behind it, and the court followed her right into the grave, turning the palace into a gallery of beautiful, dying masks. It's a chilling lesson in how power doesn't just dictate policy, it dictates physical risk. When the queen leads, the elite follow, turning a toxic choice into the definition of taste. For some, mere powder wasn't enough. The obsession eventually crossed the line from toxic to truly unhinged. If you wanted to signal that you were truly refined, you didn't just want to be white, you want to look drained. Some people actually turned to bloodletting to achieve that waxy, translucent, I'm about to collapse look. Looking robust or rosy was considered common, peasant-like, and vulgar. Looking like you might swoon at any moment was considered the height of aristocratic grace. It's wild to think about. There was a period in history where the goal of beauty was to look like you were 3 days into a severe fever. Bloodletting was already a mainstream medical practice, so it wasn't a stretch to repurpose it as a beauty hack. A pale, listless appearance became the ultimate status symbol. It told the world that your survival had never required you to be strong. It was the flex of absolute emptiness. By the 1700s, this obsession hit a fever pitch. This was the era of powdered wigs, beauty patches, and makeup so heavy it functioned like a second skull. And it gave us one of history's most haunting cautionary tales, Maria Gunning, the Countess of Coventry. Maria was a legendary beauty, a celebrity of her time, and a devotee of lead-based makeup. Even as her health began to deteriorate rapidly, she refused to stop. Her husband famously tried to stop her, but Maria wouldn't give up the look that had defined her existence. She died young, her body essentially poisoned by her own vanity. Her refusal is terrifyingly modern. We like to think we'd walk away if a product were killing us, but Maria had built her entire identity on that white mask. Abandoning it would have meant disappearing from the eyes of the world. She chose the persona over the pulse. If you look closely at these centuries of poisoning, one truth emerges, and it has nothing to do with color. Pale skin was never about aesthetics, it was about advertising asterisk idleness. Every parasol twirled, every glove buttoned, and every coat of toxic ceruse was a billboard announcing, "I do not labor." In most of history, people bragged about what they did, the wars they won, the muscles they built, the work they finished. The pale skin game was the exact inverse. The flex was total emptiness. The goal was to look like you had never done and never would do a single thing in your life. The obsession with pallor wasn't about beauty at all. It was the ultimate costume of wealth, a way of saying, I own your labor and I have never had to lift a finger in my own. The world was about to flip this logic on its head, but for these centuries, the aristocracy remained trapped in a dangerous, deadly prison of their own design, all to prove that they were too important to touch the sun. By the Victorian era, the obsession with skin had reached a fevered, almost moralistic intensity. An aristocratic proper lady was expected to be lily-white, smooth, and entirely unblemished. In this world, a single freckle wasn't just an imperfection. It was a catastrophe. It was a neon sign that you had been careless, exposed, or worst of all, laboring. The accessories of this performance were a language all their own. A parasol wasn't merely for shade. It was a loud, portable announcement that your skin was too precious to risk. Gloves in mild weather sent the same signal about your hands. Those iconic black beauty patches weren't just decorative. They were strategic frames designed to draw the eye to the flawless, powdered expanse of skin around them, like putting a spotlight on a canvas. Every prop served one function, to broadcast that you were protected, you were idle, and you were of a class that the sun was not permitted to touch. The people on the receiving end understood this perfectly. Pale meant up, brown meant down, and the gap between those two states was a social fact as immovable as gravity. The Victorians wrapped their beauty standards in a thick, suffocating blanket of morality. Paleness wasn't just attractive, it was virtuous. A delicate, untouched complexion suggested a woman who stayed close to home, who embodied the fragile femininity the age worshipped. A freckled or tanned face hinted at a woman who had been wandering, exposed, or laboring, implying a lack of modesty. Your skin became a moral resume, and a single sunspot was a stain on your character. Women treated freckle prevention with the intensity of a military campaign. They lived in constant, low-level anxiety, scanning their reflections in the mirror for the first sign of pigment that might mark them as common. It was an exhausting way to exist, treating every carriage ride and every sunlit window as a direct threat to your social standing. If you thought lead and bloodletting were the low points, the Victorians found a way to go even further. They didn't just want to look pale, they wanted a translucent, ghostly, otherworldly aesthetic. To get it, some turned to the most horrifying solution imaginable. Arsenic, a substance famous for its efficiency as a murder weapon, was rebranded as a wellness supplement. These complexion wafers were sold openly, packaged attractively, and consumed with the cheerful, lethal belief that they would brighten the skin from the inside out. The dark genius of arsenic was its deniability. Because it worked slowly, a woman could feel her health failing, vague fatigue, chronic illness, and internal decline, and blame it on nerves or the season, never suspecting that her beauty regimen was slowly liquefying her organs. They weren't just putting poison on their skin anymore, they were ingesting it. The boundary between the cosmetic counter and the poison cabinet had completely dissolved. People were literally eating themselves to death, all to chase a look that signaled they were too delicate to exist in the real world. While the upper classes were busy swallowing poison and cowering under veils, the world around them was undergoing a violent transformation. Smokestacks were rising, factories were roaring to life, and the Industrial Revolution was dragging millions of people off the sunlit fields and into dim, windowless workrooms. The ancient connection between poverty and sun exposure, the very foundation of the pale ideal, was beginning to crack. Think about the working class for a moment. For centuries, they had been branded by the sun, their skin a permanent label of their struggle. They lived in an impossible bind. Their society held up pale skin as the height of worth, while their very survival forced them to earn the mark of the laborer. There was no faking it, no escape, and no mercy from the beauty standards of the day. But as the world shifted from the field to the factory, the logic of the status symbols was about to be turned upside down. The rich were about to lose their monopoly on the indoor life, and the soot-stained face of the laborer was about to become a common sight in the city. The Victorian war on the freckle was the last frantic stand of a system whose time had run out. The machine of the modern world was rumbling, and it was carrying a tide of coal smoke that would soon make the entire pale obsession look completely, dangerously absurd. The great flip was coming. For the laboring class, the pale ideal was never a choice. It was a cage. The system was designed like a race where the winner was decided before the starting gun even fired, based entirely on who your parents were. A field worker couldn't choose to stay pale. Staying indoors meant not working, and not working meant starving. The standard wasn't just difficult to achieve. It was structurally, permanently locked behind an iron door of economic necessity, and the sun was a ruthless accountant. A laborer didn't get to choose their tan. They were branded by it daily. Their skin became a permanent, leathery record of their existence, visible from across a town square. No borrowed cloak or day off could wash it away. The cruelty reached its peak in the moral judgment society piled on top. To be sun-darkened wasn't just to be poor. It was to be labeled coarse, lesser, or disreputable. Society essentially punished the very people whose labor fed and clothed them, marking their indispensable work as an aesthetic and moral failure. It was the pale obsession's ugliest feature, a declaration that beauty was the exclusive property of those who didn't have to toil. But then the ground shifted. The Industrial Revolution rose up, and with it, the entire logic of indoor versus outdoor collapsed. As factories roared to life, the working masses were dragged from the sunlit fields into dim, smoke-choked urban prisons. They were now pale, sickly, and sun-starved not from privilege but from total deprivation. Suddenly, being colorless was no longer a sign of nobility. It was the mark of the factory floor. Simultaneously, the elite realized they had a new advantage: leisure. While the poor were trapped in factories, the wealthy were the only ones with the money and freedom to chase the sun. The location of luxury migrated from the shaded manor to the open sea. The beauty standard didn't become fairer, it just stayed faithful to the bank account. It tracked whatever the poor couldn't do. If the poor were now inside, the rich would go outside. The tan was about to become the ultimate badge of that freedom. The final nail in the coffin of the pale ideal wasn't fashion, it was medicine. Doctors began noticing that sunlight, once the enemy, was actually the cure for the terrifying diseases of the industrial city, like rickets and tuberculosis. Heliotherapy, sunlight therapy, became the new miracle cure. Sanatoriums were built in mountain ranges and along coastlines where patients were ordered to lie in the sun for hours. Overnight, the sun was recast from a destroyer of complexions into a giver of health. Once trusted physicians started prescribing sunlight, the centuries-old fear began to dissolve. The sun was now a doctor, and exposure was a sign of being on the road to recovery. Then came the spark that set the fire. Legend says it was Coco Chanel in the 1920s returning from a cruise on the French Riviera with a deep, golden glow. Whether she invented the trend or was simply the catalyst for a shift already in motion, the effect was instant. A tan stopped meaning peasant and started meaning yacht. It became the visible souvenir of a life without responsibilities, the direct opposite of the factory worker's gray, suffocating life. The logic remained identical to the medieval era, only the costume had been swapped. The elite were still advertising their leisure, but they'd moved the advertisement to the beach. The tan was now the most expensive accessory you could own, because it proved you had the time, money, and freedom to exist where the sun lived. The world had completed an astonishing about-face. The playground of the rich shifted from quiet winter retreats to sun-scorched summer stages, all for the dedicated business of bronzing. The pale ideal, which had claimed lives and poisoned generations, was gone, buried under the coal smoke of the past and replaced by the glowing golden emblem of the new modern elite. The great hinge had turned, and beauty had officially relocated to the shore. The beautiful people flocked to the coast, but they weren't there to work. They were there to lie in the sand, swim in the sea, and roast themselves until they were a deep uniform gold. It was as if they were treating their own skin like a slow-cooking trophy. A bronze glow became the ultimate living proof that you had spent your weeks lounging seaside, rather than chained to a desk or a factory machine. The beach, a place that for centuries had been a site of hard, dangerous labor for fishermen, and a place of horrific exposure for pale aristocrats, suddenly became the most aspirational stage on Earth. The reversal of the Riviera season tells the whole story. Previously, the wealthy visited the coast during the winter months, fleeing before the summer heat. Now the calendar flipped entirely. Summer, the season of maximum sunshine, became the only time to be there, precisely because the sun was the main attraction. The hotels that once shuttered their doors during the heat wave reopened to serve a crowd that had come specifically to bake. Sunbathing is, when you describe it plainly, the act of lying motionless on the ground while a star slowly changes the color of your skin. Yet, it became a serious leisure pursuit. People traveled hundreds of miles, spent significant money, and turned themselves at intervals like rotisserie chickens, measuring their social success by how deeply they could brown. Doing nothing had officially become an achievement you could show off, the purest, most expensive expression of leisure ever devised. As this sunbathing craze exploded, an obvious problem emerged. People were burning themselves to a crisp. This gave birth to the early sunscreen industry, a fascinating example of a delicious contradiction. In the 1930s, the race to manufacture sun protection began in earnest. Interestingly, much of this innovation was spurred by wartime necessity. Chemists developed thick protective substances to shield soldiers in tropical environments from blistering. That military technology eventually pivoted into the civilian luxury market. The irony here is profound. The industry didn't exist to keep people out of the sun. It existed to keep them in it longer. Protection was sold in service of exposure. People slathered on these products so they could bake for 6 hours instead of 1. They were using a safety measure to enable a dangerous behavior. It was the ultimate have your cake and eat it too business model, selling the shield so the customer could safely continue the risk. If the beach was the stage, Hollywood was the amplifier. Film stars and magazine covers paraded golden, glowing skin as the absolute height of health. The message was broadcast without a single word of explanation. If the person on the silver screen looks like this, then this is what success looks like. Meanwhile, swimwear was shrinking. As bathing suits evolved from heavy, all-covering garments into lighter, briefer designs, more skin was available to be bronzed. This created a tidy, reinforcing loop. Less fabric meant more skin, and more skin meant more canvas to tan. It turned the human body into a steadily larger billboard for leisure. For thousands of years, sunlight was the threat. Suddenly, it was the beloved friend. We took the oldest enemy in the history of beauty and turned it into the ultimate status symbol in just a few decades. By the 1950s, the devotion to the tan had reached a fever pitch. Out came the baby oil, slathered on not to block the sun but to act as a magnifying glass. Sun reflectors, sometimes lined with foil, were angled to bounce extra rays onto eager faces, a level of commitment that bordered on the heroic or the entirely absurd. Sunbathers would coat themselves head to toe, stretch out under the full glare, and turn at intervals to ensure an even finish, treating their bodies with the same care a chef uses for a roast. It was sun worship in its most literal, sizzling form. The marketing for these oils and lotions leaned into glamour, selling the tan as the secret to sophistication and health. The industry had perfectly adapted. They realized they could sell the tools to achieve a tan just as profitably as they would later sell the tools to avoid one. They had sold the public on the idea that a bronze body was a beautiful body, and for that generation, the bill for all that roasting hadn't even begun to arrive yet. The party was in full swing, the oil was flowing, and the world was happily cooking itself golden, completely unaware of the price they would eventually have to pay. The 1950s stand out in the rearview mirror of history for one primary reason: their absolute, blissful, and terrifying innocence. Back then, there was no shadow hanging over sun worship, no nagging medical warnings, no melanoma anxiety lurking in the back of the mind. People sincerely believed that a tan was the ultimate visual shortcut to health and beauty. They pursued it with the light-hearted enthusiasm of a generation that had absolutely no reason to think they were doing anything wrong. While the bronze goddess lounged in the sun, the beauty industry, always hungry for a new revenue stream, saw an opportunity for those who were too busy, too sun-shy, or too pale to wait. They were about to offer the world a shortcut, a tan in a bottle. In the early 1960s, the self-tanner arrived. It was a revolutionary promise: turn your skin golden without a single ray of sunlight. The science was genuinely clever, an ingredient that reacted with the outermost layer of your skin to produce a temporary darkening. The dream was a perfect tan from the comfort of your own bathroom. The reality, however, was a streaky, patchy, faintly orange disaster that fooled absolutely no one. Applying these early lotions was an art form that almost everyone failed at. You'd end up with dark pools around the knees and elbows, and the dreaded orange palms became the hallmark of the overeager amateur. For a long time, the fake tan was just as likely to embarrass you as it was to flatter you. Yet, it represented a quiet seismic shift. For the first time in history, a tan was being detached from the sun. You no longer needed a yacht or a free week in the Riviera to wear the color of privilege. You just needed a bottle from the local drugstore. If the 60s were the experimental phase, the late 1970s were the industrialization of the bronze. The invention of the tanning bed meant you didn't have to wait for summer, book a flight, or even step outside. You could simply climb into a coffin-shaped cabinet of ultraviolet lamps and bake yourself during your lunch break. Tanning salons exploded on every high street and strip mall, selling the fantasy of a permanent vacation for a few dollars. It was convenient, accessible, and felt thrillingly modern. But beneath the humming lights lay an uncomfortable truth. We were now voluntarily marinating ourselves in the exact concentration of radiation that our ancestors had spent thousands of years running away from. We had come full circle. We had taken the enemy, bottled it, electrified it, and sold it by the minute. The tan had been industrialized, and millions of people happily climbed into the machines to maintain a year-round glow, regardless of what the sky was doing outside. If the 50s loved a tan and the 70s industrialized it, the 1980s turned it into a full-blown religion. A deep, leathery, year-round bronze became the undisputed badge of vitality, success, and effortless cool. This was an era of excess, and the 80s tan wasn't a subtle hint of color. It was a bold, dark, aggressive statement. Certain celebrities became so famous for their permanent mahogany glow that their tan seemed to walk into the room before they did. To be tanned was to look prosperous. To be pale was to look like you simply weren't keeping up. The lengths people went to in this era were, in hindsight, genuinely reckless. The concept of the base tan, deliberately browning yourself early so you could withstand more radiation later, encouraged people to seek out damage. Sunburns were treated as an awkward stage on the way to a deeper color, an inconvenience to push through rather than a warning sign to heed. Sunscreen, when it was used at all, was often chosen for how little it interfered with the browning process. The goal was maximum darkness, and any caution was dismissed as fussiness or a failure to commit to the look. It was a culture of conspicuous abundance, where the skin became the ultimate billboard for your lifestyle. The bronze glow was no longer just a fashion statement. It was a performance of invincibility, a gleaming, oiled-up armor that everyone believed would last forever, completely unaware of the reckoning that was waiting just around the corner. Before we arrive at the scientific reckoning, it is essential to step off the Western tanning roller coaster and look at the rest of the world. While Western beaches were filled with people roasting themselves, vast regions, particularly across Asia, never lost their association between fair skin and high status. This wasn't a backward resistance to progress. It was the persistence of the original social arithmetic. In these cultures, the link between outdoor labor and darkened skin remained intact, so the preference for paleness remained the gold standard of beauty. The result was a massive, thriving global industry for skin-lightening products, a perfect mirror image counterpart to the Western tanning business. Seen side by side, these two industries reveal a profound truth. Asterisk, the specific color prize is almost beside the point. Whether a society prizes tan or pale skin, the impulse is identical. It is a social code designed to signal distance from manual labor. Beauty standards are not neutral truths. They are simply maps of who is allowed to be idle. One side of the world sold oils to darken. The other sold creams to lighten. Both were selling the exact same fantasy, that you could purchase the look of belonging to a higher leisured class. Just as the tan reached its zenith of cultural influence, science arrived to ruin the party. Researchers began to dismantle the tan as health myth piece by piece. They delivered a sobering, undeniable verdict. Asterisk, a tan is not a sign of wellness. It is a visible scar of injury. The body produces extra pigment, melanin, specifically because it is being attacked by ultraviolet radiation. The glow everyone spent millions of dollars to achieve was, in reality, the skin's desperate, panicked attempt to shield its DNA from further harm. The link to skin cancer, specifically the deadly melanoma, moved the conversation from vanity to survival. The cheerful, glamorous afternoons on the beach, the quick lunchtime sessions in the tanning bed, and the base tans of the 80s were revealed to be a gamble with one's life. The party, which had felt so harmless, suddenly had a terrifying bill attached. The history of our relationship with the sun has been a strange, inverted loop. For thousands of years, humans hid from the sun like it was an enemy. Then, for a few decadent decades, we decided it was a friend and threw ourselves into its embrace. Now, we are learning that our fearful ancestors were closer to the truth than the carefree sunbathers ever were. The cultural reckoning was unavoidable. The public health world mobilized to undo the damage of half a century of propaganda. In Australia, the front line of this crisis, the legendary Slip, Slop, Slap campaign launched in the early 1980s. It was brilliant because it didn't lecture. It provided a catchy, memorable ritual that turned sun safety into a simple habit. We are now in the midst of a slow, stubborn cultural reversal. We are learning to cover up, seek the shade, and treat the sun with the respect that our predecessors did, albeit for different reasons. The sun, once a villain to be hidden from and then a god to be worshipped, is finally being recast as what it actually is. A powerful, indifferent force that demands our caution. The great pendulum is swinging back, and the era of frying oneself golden is slowly fading into a cautionary chapter of history, reminding us that no amount of glamour can ever truly disguise the cost of ignoring our own biology. The modern reckoning with the sun was not a matter of taste, it was a matter of survival. When the International Agency for Research on Cancer classified ultraviolet tanning devices as a high-level carcinogen in 2009, it was the final, blunt slam of a door that had been left open for decades. The glamorous bronzing booth was officially rebranded as a public health hazard. The tan, which had spent a century ascending from peasant mark to yacht trophy to cool factor necessity, was suddenly stripped of its glamour and handed a new label, asterisk danger. Today, the markers of status have rearranged themselves once again. The wide-brimmed hat, the high SPF sunscreen, and the deliberate avoidance of midday heat are no longer seen as fussy. They are the ultimate signs of the modern, informed citizen. To be protected is to be smart, to be deeply tanned is to be, at best, careless and at worst, willfully ignorant of the risks. The privilege being advertised has shifted from mere leisure to knowledge. The person who stays out of the sun isn't hiding because they are poor. They are shielding themselves because they are educated. The parasol-wielding noblewoman of the 18th century and the sunscreen-slathering beachgoer of 2026 are, despite the centuries between them, performing the exact same ritual. They are both managing the burning star above them to protect their most valuable asset, themselves. We have come full circle. The wheel has turned, and the sun is once again the enemy to be managed. The bronze goddess of the 1950s, frying herself in baby oil with cheerful, reckless innocence, now looks not just like a relic, but like a cautionary tale. It is a beautiful, almost cosmic symmetry. We spent centuries poisoning ourselves with lead to look pale, and then half a century roasting ourselves to look brown. We have suffered for our standards, each generation utterly convinced that its current ideal was the timeless, obvious truth. As we reflect on this 1,000-year roller coaster, it is worth a moment of empathy for those who came before us. The Victorian lady sweating beneath her veils, the queen behind her cracking mask of white lead, and the 80s sun worshipper glistening with reflector oil, they were all just people. They weren't fools. They were simply people who wanted to be admired and who played by the brutal, invisible rules of their own time. They chased their ideals with the same stubborn, hopeful energy that drives us today. They poisoned themselves out of ignorance, not malice, and they deserve our sympathy for the simple human desire to look right. So tonight, as you rest in the comfort of an age that finally read the warning label, an age that understands the biology behind the glow, let the tension go. You are living in a rare moment where fashion and safety have finally, if only briefly, aligned. Let the long, strange story of the sun rest and let yourself drift into a peaceful, well-protected sleep.